Today, I decided to focus my remarks on stories because I've been thinking a lot about them lately, and I hoped that in preparing my remarks for this morning, I might make sense of what had really been a rather disjointed jumble of ideas. So I guess we'll see in the end if I've succeeded or not. 3 weeks ago, my father died, and I was tasked with drafting his final story, his obituary. My father enjoyed a very successful career as a lawyer, magician, mentalist, and traveled the world in search of shamans and mystery. And though I could paint a distinctive picture of his life by describing his interests and adventures, I had trouble knitting together a coherent narrative from his varied experiences. An obituary is never a true accounting of life. We leave out pieces to keep its length reasonable, or out of respect for the deceased, or sometimes to protect the living. And what's left may well be vivid, and it might be true, but it'll never be the whole enchilada, because the whole story is always more complicated. I've always loved stories, particularly those about real people. To fill a couple of weeks between the end of a high school year and a summer job, I parked myself in the corner of a local library and started reading biographies, starting with names that began with A. I got to E before I had to exchange my books for my first career wielding an ice cream scoop. I became a teacher because I became a teacher and I taught history because I love stories. I've stayed at Vermont Works for Women for nearly 2 decades because I'm surrounded by stories that touch and inspire me every day. The stories participants tell when they walk through the door and those they create when they set out on their own. To mark Vermont Works for Women's 25th anniversary in 2013, we determined to tell women's stories by developing a multimedia traveling exhibit called Labor of Love. Some of you might remember that. A celebration of 29 women nominated for being leaders in their fields and passionate about what they do. Our 29 honorees were dairy farmers, college presidents, electricians, corporate leaders, and tattoo artists. As part of the process, we paired each woman with a high school student who interviewed her to find out what made her tick and to learn her story and her path. The end product was an exhibit of photographs and audio snippets that traveled the state for a year. The purpose of our labor of love? To celebrate these individual women, certainly. But by shining a light on so many women with so many interests whose vocational paths took any number of twists and turns, we were also drawing attention to the potential of stories to shape attitudes and aspirations for all of us, but especially for young people like the interviewers. Our culture is literally awash in stories, tweets, and posts on Facebook and Instagram, Pinterest boards, YouTube rants, and round-the-clock newscasts. We trade emails about TED Talks that we like and pine for the next edition of Radiolab, or at least I do. Nearly everyone I know has participated in or is preparing for a storytelling slam. And yet when I spoke with our Labor of Love honorees, most said that the stories that they'd shared on their taped interviews were stories they'd never told before. I was really floored. These women had something to tell us about vocation and persistence, flexibility, and success. How many of us, I began to wonder, didn't tell our stories because we imagined them tedious or irrelevant, boastful or embarrassing? And what is lost? What's the cost? Particularly in terms of stories that might help young people imagine and shape their own. Telling a story is the easiest, most exciting way to explain a problem, describe a condition, make a friend, or sum up a situation. They're also an incredibly powerful teaching tool. Why? Well, in part because we're hardwired to receive and respond to them. Indeed, research indicates that stories are about 22 times more memorable than facts or bullet points. because they activate not just the language processing parts of our brain, but other parts as well. So if somebody tells us about how delicious certain foods were, that our sensory cortex will light up. And if they tell us a story that involves motion, our motor cortex gets active. And because our brains are always trying to make sense of what we're hearing, they're constantly seeking connections to whatever experiences we may have squirreled away. Researchers at Princeton University found the remarkable thing happens to our minds when we hear a story. Personal stories actually cause the brains of both storyteller and listener to exhibit what the researchers call brain-to-brain coupling. To put it simply, telling personal stories puts us in sync with the listener and helps forge human connections that are essential to our well-being. Exposure to certain kinds of stories, like family narratives, have been linked to resilience. Studies conducted by Emory University psychologists over the past 2 decades appear to demonstrate that family narratives about where one's parents met, where they lived as children, what their grandparent did, or a setback that might have put the family in debt, that these stories foster resilience in children who know them. The more children know about their past, the stronger their sense of control over their lives. And indeed, researchers determined that familiarity with one's family narratives was the best single predictor of children's emotional health and happiness. If I found any happiness in work, it has something to do with knowing my mother's narrative. She was an actress who moved to Arizona as a young bride. Jobs in show business there were pretty slim, and her career really began at 35 after she and my father divorced and we moved to LA. She found work, but given the law of averages in that field, she lost more parts than she won, which was a disappointment she didn't always hide because of the value of its essential lesson. That work can be a source of tremendous joy and a source of frustration and pain, precisely because it has deep meaning. So what are storytelling's perils? Just as narrative can be a powerfully positive force in our lives, it can serve to limit, oversimplify, or silence. In a TED Talk that has now enjoyed 7 million hits, Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie reflects on the way in which stories, specifically a single story with cultural currency, can reduce a people or a country to stereotypes. That single story, she explains, can become the only story that we know. For example, she relates how her mother repeatedly described her family houseboy as poor. When Adichie visited him in his home village, she describes being startled to enter a home in which she is shown beautiful baskets woven by the boy's brother. All I'd heard about my poor houseboy's family, she said, is that they were poor, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. It simply didn't compute for her. Poor people couldn't make or have such beautiful things. In another TED Talk, economist Tyler Cowen regarded storytelling with a particularly jaundiced eye. I was told to come here and tell you stories, he said. But what I'd like to do instead is to tell you why I'm suspicious of stories, why stories make me nervous. And in fact, he continues, the more inspired a story makes me feel, very often the more nervous I get. The good and bad things about stories is that they're a kind of filter. They take a lot of information and they leave some of it out and they keep some of it in. We make sense of our lives, Cowen laments, by squeezing our choices and events into a single, manageable, perhaps heroic narrative. If I actually had to live those journeys and quests and battles, he stated, it would just be so oppressive to me. It's like, my goodness, can't I just have my life in its messy, ordinary glory? It's fun for me. Do I really have to follow some kind of narrative? Can't I just live? And I found his message especially refreshing as a professional in human services who's often asked to share success stories. I used to like telling them. but over time, they've begun to make me uncomfortable. A story captures an end that is a snapshot in time. On Wednesday, I could tell you about a graduate who had enjoyed particular success. By Friday, she might have gone back to jail, relapsed, or been fired. Life is fragile and dynamic, particularly for many of the women with whom we work. Stories also skim over details that, if examined closely, might make the difference between a good program and an extraordinary one. As funders and advocates, we hunger for stories that follow a particular arc. She was in prison and without hope. She graduated, she came to us, enrolled in our program, and she got skills. And she graduated and now owns her own company. Well, some stories follow that line, but most of them don't. They're far more complicated and pocked by crises of confidence, unhealthy decisions, or about a bad luck. And so I don't wait to trumpet the grand success, but celebrate small steps forward with the hope that there will continue to be forward movement. It's more honest and frankly fairer to the participant, who can be overwhelmed by our hopes and expectations. A final peril of stories is simply that instead of opening a conversation, they can often silence. In our zeal to share our stories, we may drown other people out. We might offer our stories as a means of connecting with or supporting young people, but too often I think our voices crowd out those we need to hear, or assert similarities where in fact there may be very few. But don't get me wrong, we shouldn't stop telling stories just because they're tricky. Stories are critical if we're to help young people figure out who they are and what they can become. But we need to recognize stories for what they are, a distillation, a way to organize and understand. Ms. Cowan suggests we should be discerning consumers of the stories that we hear and wonder what might have been left out. We must also be as honest as possible in shaping the stories that we tell, maybe even leaving in the messy parts and forgoing a tidy ending. Human existence is complex and even contradictory. Storytelling should be too. And you know what? Young people can handle it. One of the best memoirs I've ever read is A Glass Castle by Jeanette Walls. I like it not just because it's so beautifully written or because its story is so compelling, but also because its author offers a portrait of parents who could be both abusive and tender, stunningly oblivious and surprisingly clear-eyed. Listen to this passage from the book, which describes a Christmas evening spent with her father, a gambling alcoholic who once offered his daughter to the winner of a pool game. When Christmas came that year, we had no money at all. On Christmas Eve, Dad took each one of us kids out into the desert, one by one. "Pick out your favorite star," Dad said. "I like that one," I said. Dad grinned. "That's Venus," he said. He explained to me that planets glowed because reflected light was constant and stars twinkled because their light pulsed. "I like it anyway," I said. "What the hell," Dad said. "It's Christmas. You can have a planet if you want." And he gave me Venus. Venus didn't have any moons or satellites or even a magnetic field, but it did have an atmosphere sort of similar to Earth's, except it was super hot, about 500 degrees or more. "So," Dad said, "when the sun starts to burn out and Earth turns cold, everyone might want to move to Venus to get warm, and they'll have to get permission from your descendants first." And we laughed about all the kids who believed in the Santa myth and got nothing for Christmas but a bunch of cheap plastic toys. "Years from now, when all the junk they got is broken and long forgotten," Dad said, "you'll still have your stars." I was so confused when I read this. Such a sweet and enduring gesture from a man that 2 pages earlier I'd wanted to haul off and punch. But it's precisely why I loved this book and admire Walls. Her father is neither monster nor saint, but a complicated tangle of contradiction. Which now brings me back to my own father and his obituary. What it didn't mention was the fact that he was married and divorced twice, that in later life he lost his money and with it his identity. And most important to me, that these setbacks had a profoundly mellowing effect. Stripped of the trappings that had defined him for so long, he became vulnerable and open. These pieces of his story ultimately invited me in ways that hadn't been possible before, and to embrace and to love all that he was. I've talked about my mother, and I've talked about my father, and it seems only fair that I end this reflection by telling a few stories on myself, and even by considering how my own obituary might read. Which I know sounds a little morbid, but just hang in there with me. So, the one that might appear in the Free Press might include the following information. Tiffany Bluemle died peacefully in Burlington, Vermont. Born in Arizona, she spent her high school years in Los Angeles before attending Princeton University, where she was awarded the Jolene Prize in History for her senior thesis on Sandra Day O'Connor. After graduation, she worked on Walter Mondale's presidential campaign before pursuing a master's in public administration from Harvard. Prior to moving to Vermont, she taught middle and high school history and was one of the youngest members of Princeton's Board of Trustees. She served as executive director of Vermont Works for Women for 17 years. She has survived and will be missed by her partner Liz Shane and her two sons, Will and Jake. In lieu of flowers, friends and family members are invited to make contributions to the Vermont Respite House. The unabridged version might read, however, like this. Tiffany Bluemle died peacefully in Burlington, Vermont. I mean, really, why change that part? Born in Arizona, she was uprooted when her parents divorced and was moved to Los Angeles. She hated LA for the first year because she was neither tan nor blonde and spent 9th grade in remedial PE because her kneecaps had not caught up with her legs. Not really knowing anything about it before she went, she attended Princeton University, where she was again miserable and kept an application to transfer to another college in her top desk drawer. In spite of a lackluster academic career in which she received a C in both calculus and music appreciation, which is really hard to do. She was awarded a history prize for her senior thesis, which was a minor miracle since she had lost 60 pages of her first draft to a computer glitch 3 weeks before it was due. Serving as a university trustee was one of the scariest things she has ever done. She worked on Walter Mondale's losing presidential campaign, which launched fellow Gopher D.D. Meyer's blockbuster career and eventual appointment as President Clinton's press secretary, but distinguished Bluemle only as the driver who managed to make Mrs. Mondale miss a radio interview because she missed the exit. She was hired by Vermont Works for Women in 1997 and served as its executive director for 17 years, during which she wondered daily if she really knew what she was doing. She has survived and will be missed by her partner and her two sons, who are smart and wonderful, but who have incredibly smelly feet. And in lieu of flowers, friends and family members are invited to make contributions to the Vermont Respite House. Well, no, actually, make them to Vermont Works for Women, because we can always use the cash. Thank you.